I've never told this story outside of a few late-night conversations and one therapist who probably thought I was exaggerating. For context, my name is William, and throughout my life I've done things I'm not proud of. Some were stupid, some were reckless, and a few crossed lines that can't be uncrossed. This is the story of one of those times. It started with a sentence I overheard from an old man who had spent most of his life collecting junk and secrets in equal measure. "A hiding place in the wall is a find that has been hidden for years," he said. At the time, I didn't think much of it. It sounded like the kind of cryptic nonsense older people enjoy saying after a couple of drinks. But weeks later, those words came back to me. Back then I was 29, broke, angry, and carrying more debt than I could realistically pay off. I was working odd construction jobs, moving from project to project, barely keeping my head above water. Every month felt like a race against eviction notices and collection calls. One of those jobs involved renovating an abandoned house on the edge of town. The place was ancient. Water stains covered the ceilings. The floorboards creaked like they were complaining about every step. Most people looked at it and saw a building waiting to be demolished. I saw opportunity. The owner had inherited the property from a distant relative and wanted it cleared out before selling it. My crew spent days hauling away furniture, rotten boxes, and decades of forgotten belongings. That was when I noticed something strange. One section of the dining room wall sounded different. Not dramatically different. Just enough. While removing damaged plaster, I tapped along the surface with a hammer. Most of the wall produced a dull, solid thud. One section gave off a hollow sound. I remember freezing for a second. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was an old repair job. Or maybe it was exactly what that old man had been talking about. For the rest of the day I couldn't stop thinking about it. The hollow space sat behind a layer of plaster and brick that looked untouched for decades. If there was something hidden there, nobody on the crew knew about it. The property owner certainly hadn't mentioned anything. That night I barely slept. I kept imagining what could be inside. Old documents. Jewelry. Cash. Nothing. Everything. The possibilities were endless, and the more I thought about them, the more dangerous my thoughts became. Because by the next morning, I wasn't wondering whether something was hidden in that wall. I was wondering whether I could take it before anyone else discovered it. The problem was simple: even if there was something hidden behind that wall, it didn't belong to me. The owner legally owned the house. Anything inside it was his. I knew that. Every member of the crew would have agreed with that. But when you're desperate enough, your brain starts treating facts like obstacles instead of truths. For 3 days I kept working in that room, pretending not to care. Every time my hammer struck near the hollow section, I felt a rush of curiosity. Nobody else seemed to notice it. Nobody else tapped the wall. Nobody else asked questions. That made things worse. I started planning. Nothing elaborate at first. Just small thoughts. Stay late. Come back after hours. Open the wall carefully. Look inside. If there's nothing there, close it up and leave. I even convinced myself I wasn't stealing yet. I told myself I was only investigating. Deep down, though, I already knew what I wanted to find. And I knew exactly what I'd do if I found it. Once I decided I was going to open the wall, the whole thing stopped feeling like curiosity and started feeling like a job. I paid attention to everyone's routines. The foreman left first almost every evening. 2 workers usually rushed out together to beat traffic. The owner only visited the property once or twice a week. I wasn't looking for weaknesses at first, but before long I was mapping them out in my head. I began staying a little later than everyone else. Nothing suspicious. I'd sweep up debris, organize tools, or claim I wanted overtime. The crew appreciated the extra effort. Looking back, that's the part that bothers me most. Their trust made what I was planning easier. I also checked the windows and doors, figuring out which entrance I could use if I came back after dark. Every detail mattered. The more prepared I became, the harder it was to back out. I remember standing in front of that hollow section one evening after everyone had left. My heart was racing. For the first time, I realized I wasn't thinking about whether to do it anymore. I was thinking about when. I returned to the house on a Thursday night, about an hour after sunset. The street was quiet, and most of the neighboring homes were dark. I parked several blocks away because I didn't want anyone connecting my truck to the property. Even then, I was nervous enough to turn around twice before finally walking to the house. I had brought a flashlight, a pry bar, a utility knife, and a small bucket for debris. My plan was simple: make as little noise as possible and leave no obvious signs that someone had been there. Inside, the place felt completely different from during the day. Every creak sounded louder. Every shadow seemed to move. I went straight to the dining room. For a few seconds, I just stared at the section of wall. Then I started cutting away the plaster. The work was slower than I expected. Dust filled the air. Pieces of old material crumbled into the bucket. Then my pry bar struck something solid behind the opening. Not brick. Not wood. Metal. The sound echoed through the room, and my stomach dropped. For a moment, I thought about leaving. That metallic sound had made the whole thing real. Up until then, I could still pretend I was just satisfying my curiosity. But now there was proof that someone had deliberately hidden something inside the wall. I widened the opening with shaking hands. Behind the bricks sat a small metal box covered in rust and dust. It wasn't large, about the size of a toolbox, but it looked old enough to have been there for decades. I carefully pulled it out and set it on the floor. The lock had long since corroded. A few strikes with the pry bar broke it loose. When the lid finally opened, I just stared. Inside were stacks of yellowed envelopes, several pieces of jewelry, and bundles of cash wrapped in cloth that had nearly fallen apart with age. My pulse exploded. I remember actually laughing. Not because it was funny, but because I couldn't believe what I was seeing. The cash alone looked like more money than I'd had in my bank account during the previous 5 years combined. And that's when greed completely took over. I wish I could tell you I hesitated. I wish I could say I spent an hour debating the right thing to do, weighing my options like some morally conflicted character in a movie. The truth is much less flattering. The second I saw that money, my mind shifted into justification mode. I told myself the house had been abandoned for years. I told myself nobody even knew the box existed. I told myself that if I hadn't found it, it would have stayed hidden forever. Those excuses came frighteningly easily. I packed the cash and jewelry into my backpack and shoved the old documents back into the box. Looking back, that decision was incredibly stupid. I was thinking only about what seemed valuable at the moment. Then I faced another problem. The hole in the wall. I spent nearly an hour trying to cover my work. I replaced loose material, swept up dust, and arranged debris to make the area look untouched. It wasn't perfect. As I left the house, I kept looking over my shoulder. For the first time, excitement was giving way to fear. I barely slept that night. The backpack sat in the corner of my apartment, and every time I looked at it, I felt two completely opposite emotions. One was excitement. The other was dread. By morning, dread was winning. When I arrived at the job site, I was convinced everyone would somehow know. I'd imagined police cars outside the house, the owner demanding answers, my coworkers staring at me. None of that happened. Everything looked normal. The crew joked around, drank coffee, and complained about the weather. Nobody seemed suspicious. Nobody pulled me aside. Nobody mentioned the dining room wall. For a few hours, I actually started to relax. Then the owner arrived. I remember seeing his car pull into the driveway and feeling my stomach tighten instantly. He spent most of the morning walking through the house with the foreman. They talked about repairs and costs while I tried to focus on my work. Then I heard the owner say something that froze me in place. Apparently, he'd discovered an old family journal. And according to that journal, something valuable had once been hidden inside the house. The moment I heard that conversation, my blood ran cold. The owner wasn't speaking loudly, but I caught enough to understand the situation. The journal had belonged to a relative who lived in the house decades earlier. According to a handwritten note inside it, a collection of valuables had been concealed somewhere on the property during a financial dispute. Nobody knew the exact location. Not yet. But they were now actively looking. I spent the rest of the day pretending to work while listening to every word I could. The owner seemed excited rather than suspicious. He believed the items were still hidden somewhere in the house. That should have made me feel relieved. Instead, it made me nervous. People searching for something tend to search thoroughly. Late that afternoon, the foreman called everyone together and asked us to report anything unusual we'd found during demolition. Nothing was being accused. It sounded routine. Still, I felt every eye in the room. I said nothing. Everyone else said nothing too. But walking home that evening, I realized the secret hiding place was no longer forgotten. And that meant my window of safety was closing. That evening, I made a mistake that nearly unraveled everything. Up to that point, I'd focused only on the cash and jewelry. The papers I'd left in the metal box seemed worthless compared to what I'd taken. But after hearing about the family journal, I couldn't stop thinking about them. What if those documents mattered? What if they explained who had hidden the valuables, or who they truly belonged to? The curiosity eventually got the better of me. Around midnight, I drove back to the house. The neighborhood was silent. I slipped inside through the same entrance I'd used before and went straight to the dining room. The box was still there. I opened it and pulled out the envelopes. Inside were letters, receipts, and several handwritten notes. Most were difficult to read, but one thing became immediately clear: the valuables weren't simply hidden savings. There was a bitter family dispute behind them. As I sorted through the papers, I suddenly heard a noise from elsewhere in the house. A door closing. Not slamming. Closing. Someone else was inside. And I knew it wasn't supposed to be occupied. The sound wasn't loud, but in an empty house at midnight, it felt deafening. I froze beside the open metal box, listening. For several seconds, there was nothing. Then I heard footsteps. Slow. Careful. Definitely human. My first thought was that the owner had come back. My second was that it might be police. Neither possibility made me feel any better. I switched off my flashlight immediately. The dining room dropped into darkness. The footsteps continued somewhere near the front hallway. Whoever was inside seemed to be moving cautiously, almost like they didn't want to be discovered either. That realization scared me even more. If it wasn't the owner, then who was it? I crouched behind a partially demolished wall and waited. The footsteps stopped. Silence. Then a beam of light swept across a nearby doorway. Another flashlight. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure the person could hear it. For nearly a minute neither of us moved. Then I caught a glimpse of a figure crossing the hall. Not a police officer. Not the owner. It was someone from my construction crew. And he looked just as nervous as I felt. For a few seconds neither of us knew the other was there. Then my boot shifted on a piece of broken plaster. The sound was tiny. It was enough. The flashlight beam snapped toward me, and I heard a sharp intake of breath. Before either of us could think of a convincing lie, we were staring at each other across the ruined dining room. It was Eric, one of the guys from the crew. His expression told me everything. He wasn't there to inspect the property. He wasn't there to work. He was there for exactly the same reason I was. "What are you doing here?" he whispered. The question was ridiculous coming from someone sneaking through the house after midnight. Neither of us answered immediately. Then his eyes dropped to the open metal box. My stomach tightened. He knew. Maybe not everything, but enough. For the next several minutes we traded half-truths and vague explanations. Neither of us admitted anything directly. But suspicion hung in the air. Eventually Eric said something that made my pulse spike. "The owner knows the hiding place existed now. and then he asked whether anything had already been taken. I should have told the truth. Not because it would have been noble, but because it would have been simpler. Instead, I chose the option that felt safest in the moment. I lied. I looked Eric straight in the eye and told him the box had been empty when I found it. The words came out surprisingly smoothly. Too smoothly. Eric didn't argue. He didn't accuse me of stealing anything. He just stared at me for a few seconds longer than felt comfortable. That was the problem. He didn't believe me. I could see it in his face. He glanced at the scattered papers, the broken lock, and the damaged wall. None of it matched the story I was trying to sell. Still, he let it go. At least outwardly. We left the house separately and agreed not to mention the late-night visit to anyone. The next morning, Eric barely spoke to me. Then I noticed something else. Whenever the owner visited the property, Eric seemed to be watching both him and me. Not casually. Carefully. Like he was waiting for one of us to make a mistake. Over the next week, the pressure became unbearable. Nobody accused me of anything, but I started seeing suspicion everywhere. Every conversation sounded loaded. Every glance felt like an investigation. The worst part was that Eric had become unpredictable. Sometimes he acted completely normal. Other times he would ask strange questions out of nowhere. Did you ever figure out what was inside those envelopes? Or, funny how some people get lucky, isn't it? Each comment sounded harmless on its own. Together they felt like probes. Then came the moment that truly rattled me. The owner gathered the crew and announced that a family member had reviewed the documents recovered from the box. According to them, the jewelry collection was historically significant to the family, and several pieces were easily identifiable. My chest tightened. Until then, I'd assumed the jewelry could eventually be sold. Now I learned photographs of some items apparently still existed. Suddenly, what I'd possessed wasn't just stolen property. It was traceable. That night I spread everything across my apartment floor. For the first time since finding the cash, I wasn't thinking about profit. I was thinking about getting rid of evidence. The cash had always been the main attraction, but the jewelry had become a liability. I spent hours sitting on my apartment floor, staring at it. Every piece that had looked valuable a week earlier now looked dangerous. The owner's announcement kept replaying in my head. Historical. Identifiable. Documented. Those weren't words a thief wants to hear. I considered throwing everything away. I considered burying it. I even thought about anonymously mailing it back. But every option carried risk, and fear was making me irrational. In the end, I chose the worst solution possible. I tried to move some of the jewelry through a contact I'd known for years, a guy who bought and resold questionable items with very few questions. The meeting lasted less than 10 minutes. He examined one piece, frowned, and handed it back. Then he asked where I'd gotten it. Not casually. Seriously. Something about the item had clearly caught his attention. I made an excuse and left immediately. 2 days later, Eric approached me after work and said he needed to talk. The look on his face told me this wasn't a friendly conversation. Eric confronted me in the parking lot after everyone else had left. There was no point pretending anymore. He told me he'd figured it out weeks earlier. The late-night visit, my nervous behavior, the damaged wall, the way I'd reacted whenever the hidden cash was mentioned, it all added up. What surprised me was what happened next. He didn't threaten me. He didn't demand a share. He simply told me that I was becoming someone I wouldn't recognize if I kept going down that path. At the time, I wanted to dismiss it as nonsense. But part of me knew he was right. A few days later, I anonymously returned the jewelry and several documents. The cash was another matter. Most of it had already been spent on debts, rent, and bills. I was never arrested. Nobody ever knocked on my door. Officially, I got away with it. But that's not the same as escaping consequences. Years later, I still remember how easily I justified crossing a line I once thought I'd never cross. If there's any lesson here, it's this: Desperation can explain bad choices, but it doesn't excuse them. The moment you start convincing yourself that nobody will be hurt, you're already lying to yourself. That's the part that stays with me.